Hi, I'm Mark, and it's my second time in Porto, and it's great to be back. It's interesting as well how we've just followed that last talk about automation, because some of what this is doing is automation with documents. In the past year, I've been a master's student at Cambridge, specialising in health data science as part of the MPhil in population health sciences. And during my time there, I wrote all my notes in a digital format via software called Obsidian.md. And essentially what was great about that was the ability to connect my notes together over that period, and it's really enabled me to improve my comprehension of those notes. I developed a Python package to analyze my Obsidian notes called Obsidian Tools, and towards the end of the talk I'll go through some of the functionality of that. In terms of the outline for this talk, I'll kick off by spending about 10 minutes going through an introduction to personal knowledge management, or PKM. Essentially, personal knowledge management is about managing notes, managing knowledge, and different approaches and methodologies there are around that, and even software. PKM even goes back before the digital era, so I'll briefly cover some of the approaches that people have done before this century for managing their knowledge quite well. And towards the end of that section, I'll introduce this idea about connected notes, this thing that I think is very powerful. And to put that into context, that next section I'll go through the notes from my MPhil, which I developed in the form of connected notes. And towards the very end, I'll go through my Python package Obsidian Tools, some of the functionality there, and how I've analysed notes, and briefly some of the data science challenges that this type of data, these notes can give. I've got this slide here with essentially to go through extra material. In case you want to go through some of the PKM concepts that come up, this will enable you to go through some of those things in more detail. So on there I have curated some resources and material such as blog posts and videos, and it only really scratches at the surface of what's out there on PKM. There's certainly a lot that I'm still learning about it. So feel free to scan that QR code to access those. This talk only introduces PKM and an application of it. If you want to explore it in more depth, then that material can certainly be useful for that, for going into PKM concepts, or even making your own digital notes via software like Obsidian. Now let's kick off with an intro to PKM. And essentially what we have here, scholars have developed systems over time to manage their knowledge and note-taking. Hundreds of years ago, scholars were managing their knowledge, for example, through writing notes on index cards, and they could store them in slip boxes to organise them, even on a larger scale, putting them in filing cabinets when you have many notes. This approach is called the Zettelkasten system, and literally in German that means slip box. Essentially, with Zettelkasten, the principle is that each note is represented by an index card, and that would represent one concept, one idea, one thing, in terms of how you want to frame it. One way you could even name a note is to have the timestamp, that moment in time that you had a thought. And essentially, depending on how you name things, like a convention for your notes, you could organise them, in those slip boxes or folders on a file system via, or group it by the subject matter or the chronological order in time that you created those notes and had those thoughts. In terms of Zettelkasten itself, In the 20th century, the sociologist Nicholas Luhmann developed a Zettelkasten of over 90,000 notes, and this was, before the digital era. And his digital archive actually is, I have a link to it in that extra material, in case you want to have a look through that. Even before then, in the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus developed his own Zettelkasten of a few thousand notes in the 18th century. So this approach for managing knowledge has been used in practice for hundreds of years, and has also been kind of reused and adapted for the digital era using computers. In terms of the use cases for PKM, I mean, there are so many that I could cover here, but I've mentioned a few. The first one, study notes. I will go deeper into that in this talk when talking about the notes on my MPhil and how I've done that through connected notes. Another very big one here is daily notes or journaling. Essentially, people can make note-taking a daily habit, and the notes that they make on a daily basis could have their own structure and cover many different things. So these are some that I've found that would be useful to cover. So people might make notes on a daily basis to cover fleeting thoughts that they've had during the day, to-do lists or tasks that they want to cover that day, a gratitude journal for keeping track of things that they're grateful for that day, notes from meetings, notes from conversations, a mood log to track over time how they've been feeling, like when they're most happy and why. The third one there, wiki, is probably one you're familiar with, like an encyclopedia, and I developed my MPhil notes in essentially like a connected note system that functions as a wiki. Those last two bullet points I've put there as they're very specific examples, and I have examples of people who have developed templates to do that sort of thing. So that first one there, a log of books that you have read or want to read. It's like essentially like a bookshelf. There's a template there that someone made. And even recipes, like, one file could be an ingredient, and then you have multiple ingredients then linked to in the recipe for a meal. So I've included some of that material there. There are just many different ones that can be done. The focus for the rest of this talk is about connected notes. The main software options for connected notes are Obsidian.md and Roam Research. I personally use Obsidian. Both have gained traction in the last 2 to 3 years, so connected notes are relatively new in adoption. It's also worth mentioning that some SaaS solutions can be used for PKM. For example, Notion it might be one that you're familiar with, that is used by teams for project management and note-taking. In the extra material, I have a link to a blog post of a case where someone is using Notion for PKM purposes. Now, introducing Obsidian. Obsidian is free to use PKM software, which is cross-platform. However, Roam Research is not free. I think the pricing plan for Roam Research is about $10 per month, but Obsidian is free. With this software, you can write your notes in markdown files and make connections to them through wiki links. So on the screen there in Lilac, that use of double square brackets, that's called a wiki link, and you can have those across your notes to build up connections between notes. Markdown is a versatile format for storing notes, and Obsidian uses a form of Markdown that's extended to support extra functionality such as LaTeX math equations, for example, in the note rendering. The ethos of Obsidian is that you have total control over your notes on your local machine. Why that's quite important is that over time, some people have stored their notes on cloud services, for example, that have shut down, and that kind of thing can give an issue of vendor lock-in and just losing your notes completely. But with Obsidian, you can keep it all on your computer, on different operating systems, on hard drives, easily readable. In this section now, I'll go over my MPhil notes as connected notes. This here is an annotated graph of all my notes that I've written over the past year on my course. So there's hundreds of notes in there. Each point there, which is coloured, is a note that I've made, and I've done that so that it's one note is a concept, essentially. As I said at the very start, in the past year, I've studied my MPhil degree at the University of Cambridge. I did a quantitative program in health data science. On that, I studied 11 modules in areas such as epidemiology, biostatistics, public health, machine learning, genetics, genomics. And in terms of the organization of the notes, I colored them by module because that's how I was revising my notes. So for example, in yellow there, you'll see notes for epidemiology concepts, and ones in the top left corner in shades of pink, those are ones relating to machine learning. Now I'll go through an example of one of my notes and show how I made a new connection from it. You won't need to read this in full. This is just an example. I'll go through it's just one bullet point will be where the new connection is made. So what we have here on this screen is a note I made for this concept called Outbreak Response, which is a concept in public health. The image here is how the markdown is rendered. What I like about this note as an example is it's a good example of illustrating the power of connecting those thoughts. So for this, the steps in essentially what this concept is. It's the steps involved in the response to a disease outbreak. They're in bullet points, and those encompass multiple topics. So I made some wiki links in those, and so the purple notes in there are examples of wiki links, which are connections to other notes. But when going back to this note recently, something I noticed was that there was another link that I could create. So at the bottom of this image here, I have a heading there for case definition and measurement. But I noticed that in the fourth bullet point, this is where it's already mentioned. So it says there, establish a case definition and mechanisms for case ascertainment. So I then made this new note called case definition and added a wiki link. Now here you can see this is the same note, but it's now shown on screen as how you'd write the markdown. So you've got like a hash symbol for the heading, for example. And yeah, this bullet point about case definition, as I said earlier, I could create a note for it, so I made a wiki link here that's highlighted, and then created a new file. I could then move some of that content in that last slide at the bottom into a new note. So essentially here, this is bringing in more abstraction. I've got this new concept, I can create a new note for it and make things a lot more modular in a way. And yeah, as I was saying, this image here shows the actual markdown content as its input. For the wiki link format, what you'll see here is that it's in the form of the note name, and then you can have an alias for it. And it can make it quite elegant for doing one note, or having a link to a note with many different aliases across your notes. Now, this last slide about this example here, an outbreak response. This image shows now how the note is rendered. It also shows this new note case definition. I'm hovering over it here. So you can then see how this connection is essentially displayed. Yeah, so the preview of the new note. This was a quick walkthrough of how I edited my notes and improved them through another iteration. And this is something you could do multiple times, like over the course of a year, as I've done. Now, I'm not prescriptive of a knowledge management approach, but something I find useful is breaking down notes further to represent distinct concepts has been very useful for me. It's a bit like repurposing your notes and capturing more abstraction in them. And this idea of having each note represent one thing, or an idea or a concept, is a philosophy of making notes atomic. So this is this philosophy of atomic notes. And I've got some links in the extra material for that, in case you're interested. What's also quite powerful about Obsidian is, now you see there I've got that case definition note. These slides don't really do justice to it, but when you're in the app, when you're in the case definition note, you can then have a small graph where you can see what's called a backlink. And a backlink is which note has a wiki link, to that note. So case definition would have a backlink of Outbreak Response, because Outbreak Response has a wiki link to case definition. It takes a bit of getting used to, but it's very powerful when you get around to exploring backlinks. Now, I'll try here to do an animation of my knowledge graph over time, and now it's running. So I've got 2 minutes to walk through what's happening over time. So we've got this 2-minute animation, and the first set of modules on my MPhil were studied by all students, regardless of how quantitative their specialisms were. In my first 2 months, I studied epidemiology, which are those notes in yellow, and statistics, biostats, those notes in red. Epidemiology is the study of disease, and stats methods are core to research in that field. For example, to estimate the risk that an individual has of developing a disease or based on a certain trait. I finished off 2021 by learning public health, which is those notes in blue, data analytics in those notes in green, and research skills in purple. By the end of the year, I had over 250 notes. In 2022, I studied my elective modules, which are quantitative in nature. The new notes that will appear are focused on the right-hand side of the diagram in the realm of statistics. For example, notes there in shades of pink and salmon are in the areas of stats and machine learning. Now looking at the top of the graph, there are notes there in shades of spring green, which are in the areas of genetic epidemiology and genomics. While developing these notes over time, it was becoming clear to me how concepts across the different modules could relate to each other. It's essentially like a constellation of stars forming before your eyes. Being able to view notes in a graph like this enabled me to reflect on, for example, which concepts were key to topics, which were at the intersection of different topics, and what new connections I could draw between concepts. Doing my analytics of the notes in Python as well via my Python package was also a game changer for me in my note-taking, improving my note-taking and my learning. And yeah, we've hit the end of that animation now. Whirlwind tour. Now let's go through my Obsidian Tools package. This package is available on PyPI to download. My first release was a year ago, but I've done more development earlier this year. It now has over 100 stargazers on GitHub, so feel free to check that out if you end up using Obsidian. In terms of the setup, it's quite simple. This is all there is to it. First of all, you initialize a vault object for the directory that points to the directory of your notes. Now, this terminology of vault, this is specific to Obsidian. So a collection of notes in Obsidian is called a vault. that terminology might translate across different software, but I find it quite intuitive that one collection of notes is a vault. And when I've been using Obsidian, I have many different vaults, and this one that I've gone through for my MPhil is by far my biggest vault. That first code snippet at the top, this is a list of directories. So I have one per module on my MPhil, and you can specify the config to filter on certain subdirectories, for example, for how you want to analyze your notes. Obsidian Tools is a Fluent API, and there are two main methods to call once you've imported it. The first one there is connect. Connect is needed to build the network that you see in the Obsidian app, and that was an example of what was seen earlier in that final part of the animation. The final network is recreated in Python via the networkx library. The second method there is gather, and gather is used to store the text from your notes, your files, in a format that is fit for textual analysis and NLP, and that's something that's interested me quite a lot as a data scientist. This here shows, essentially what I've done is use this. I've created a data frame that has a summary of all my notes metadata via the get note metadata function. And those summary stats there at the bottom shows that I have over 800 notes in my that I've developed over the past year for my course. And you'll see there it says 576 files. So a key thing here is that there are over 800 notes in that graph itself, but many of them will be grayed out because there are wiki links to that note in other files, but the note hasn't been created yet. So that's also a way you can do discovery of finding out, oh, I have this concept and it's quite central in the graph, but I've not made a note on it. Maybe that's worth me doing. So it's also been quite intuitive and convenient for me to identify which notes I have that have so many links to them, but they just haven't had any content put in a file, put to paper, essentially. So this is just from a year of my study. So I said in my first 3 months that I had over 250 notes written, and then that just kept developing over time. But some people have developed vaults that have thousands and thousands of notes. So it's something that's quite interesting for automation at scale, like how you can then do that knowledge management more effectively. That summary from the previous slide is just retrieved via using the connect method. But now, in this slide, I'm looking at the text content, the NLP analytics. To do that, I need to do a call on the gather method so that I can access the content from those notes. I made a basic pipeline with a Spacey package to get the word counts from my notes and stored each of those in a dictionary, and that's called here word count index, which is right at the top. From these code snippets, you can see that I have over 140,000 words across my notes, that bit highlighted there. That average is 250 words per note, so to try and imagine it physically, that could be an A5 page printout, just the size of a notepad, a small notepad. One note would be a page in there, and then you can obviously think, how many A5 pages would you have stacked on top of each other, and then it's almost like a textbook. So some of my notes had quite a lot of content to cover, but were hard to break down into other concepts. On the right-hand side there, I've put the word counts sorted by note, and yeah, there are some there that have over 1,000 words in them. And well, some people might say that's too much. If you're looking at the principle of atomic notes, you could probably boil that down to even more abstraction. But something about personal knowledge management is that there's not one way of doing note-taking, one way of doing PKM. But for my study, it was intuitive having it like this, thinking about it as a wiki. Right, very close to the end now. This is just one slide on data science challenges that you may face with this type of data. On the right there, this is a tweet from the creator of Rome Research, and what he's put there is that there's a $150,000 prize for someone who can make an extension for Rome Research that can suggest connections between nodes. And it's not high on his list, but yeah, the option's out there for someone. That was put out just about a year ago. What's quite interesting about this is that you'll see that there's different types of data involved. So we have network data, the data that's in the graph, and we also have within each node text data. So you've got those two different types of data, and with that at hand, there are many questions you could ask yourself about a collection of notes. For example, what are the most central notes in my vault? What are the main topics in a note or in a collection of notes? That first one you can get just via looking at the network data, the graph data. The second one you can get just by looking at the content from the text data. But what is very interesting as a challenge for this bounty, this problem, is that you really just need to combine both. And yeah, to look at for looking at these types of data, you can look at applying graph algorithms. You can apply NLP modeling techniques to help solve these sorts of problems. One area that is particularly challenging is this area of combining both to suggest new connections between nodes. And I've not seen much out there on this, so it's definitely a new field and something that I'll keep looking at, as it's very interesting. Now for the wrap-up. As I said at the start, personal knowledge management, or PKM, has evolved over time, and this is something that's also before the digital era. The Zettelkasten system is one of the earliest approaches for formalizing an approach for managing knowledge. Markdown is a popular file format for storing digital notes, and I briefly went over connected notes, and the two main software options for that are Obsidian.md and Rome Research. I've also shown how connected notes can look for study notes as one use case of PKM, but I had that list earlier where there are so many different examples of how people want to take notes and what they want to do with them. For example, daily notes, or even something like storing information about recipes. I developed Obsidian tools as a Python package to augment my PKM workflows, and I touched upon some of the challenges that you might have in data science of, what are the most central notes in my collection of notes, which ones can I form new connections between notes. There's so many different problems that are out there that can be solved, and many different tools that could help in that pursuit. That's it. Happy to connect on LinkedIn or GitHub. And yeah, I didn't have a slide at the end going back to the QR code, but I can always go back to that if you're still interested in looking at that.
Thank you.